What's up, everybody, and welcome into another exciting edition of the Stay Hungry podcast. This is ZFarls here. It's been about a week or two, but this is the first moment I've had since I recorded the last one alone to myself, so I'm jumping in to take advantage of that time to record this for you guys. Remember, we got to get to 10 podcasts total. That's the goal, one of them with S. Gibbs. That is our 2020 mission, so this is podcast number 6. Today we're going to talk about questions you should ask yourself. And I think that there's some good ones in there that can help give you some diagnostics, a look at into some of your patterns, some of the things you're thinking about, and what you can do to ask good questions to kind of see what your perspective is on things, where other people could be coming from, so that you can ultimately arrive at the best decision you can make. It's kind of a general decision-making tree, and some of these questions I found in a Twitter thread I thought were really, really interesting, and we'll talk about those. We do start every podcast with either a topic or something that we're thinking about or something that's cool. And today, let's just keep it simple, a little bit of gratitude. I was just thinking that when I turn my shower on, hot water comes out within like 5 seconds, and that's pretty awesome. You don't have to wait for it. Used to have to wait like 2 minutes for it to heat up. Living here in Florida, hot water just comes right out. You never even think about it. You never even really enjoy it, but it's awesome. It's cool. It's something you should take 5 seconds and be like, wow, a lot's happened for me to get all this. And just something I was thinking about just before the show, which is why I'm probably sweating. But that's how it's going to be. I moved the camera back a little bit 2 episodes ago, so you don't have to see. It's a new haircut. I don't love it. And then you got the sweat mustache. I usually get up close. So those are what's happening with me. But I'm excited to jump into some of these topics. As always, I'll take your questions in the comments, and we will discuss more things on future episodes. If you have an idea for a topic you want to hear about, let me know. All right, so this tweet comes from James Clear, who's the author in the podcast we talked about. Books that we had read recently was Atomic Habits. He wrote that book. That's how I became familiar with him. Started following him on Twitter, and he tweets out insightful stuff, things to think about. So his tweet that I read the other day that sparked this idea was, someone once suggested that I occasionally ask myself, what am I really trying to achieve here? Whenever I remember to do it, I find the question generates useful answers. What is one question you find useful to ask yourself? So a lot of people came in the comments with great questions that they ask themselves consistently, and I'm going to read some of those questions, some of the ways that the thinking could go based on those, and then I'll try and think of a question that I might ask myself. So his question was, what am I really trying to achieve here? And if you take a step back and think, whether it's an email that comes in that you want to respond to quickly or boldly or negatively or whatever, ultimately think about your end goal. And that doesn't just mean I want to get my way, or I want to get a lower price on this thing, or I want to get the answer I need to move forward. Ultimately think about your end goal with this interaction, with where you're trying to go a little bit later than just this next interaction. So if you're on hold and you're trying to rebook your flight, maybe you're trying to go to LA, when that person picks up, don't forget what you're really trying to achieve is you're trying to get to LA so you can make it to wherever you're trying to go. You're not trying to win an argument with the lady or the man on the phone to prove that the plane was wrong, to prove that you should get your money back. You're really just trying to ultimately get to LA so you can bypass the anger, the frustration, the fact that you were wronged. You're just trying to get that done. So maybe that's one time you could use this, hopefully pull you out of some of the emotional state that you're in, the shorter-term thinking, and hopefully get you looking at a long-term answer. One from William Minshew, a reply was, how important is this really? That's one that I think is a great question to ask. What is this really driving? What's the impact? What is the purpose of it? If I don't do this task, how important is it really? If traffic's frustrating you and you're still going to make it on time, like how important is it for you to get frustrated by that traffic? Because is it really, that's not really the generation of this question. I think the generation of this question is like, how much time are you spending on work, and how important is that work really? There's a matrix of urgent versus important. Like, is this work urgent or is it important? Urgent work is something you have to do right away, but that doesn't make it important. If it's important work, it may be like doing your taxes. It's not urgent. It's not urgent until April 15th, April 14th. Your taxes don't become urgent, but they're important to do because you have to do them before a certain date. So Urgent versus important. How important is this really? Is a good question to ask. So you can kind of consider the value of things that you're doing and whether or not you could be better served doing something else. Another one from anybody is, what's going to change in the next 10 years? It's a good question to think about. What's not going to change in the next 10 years? Now, those are two overarching questions, but I like where he goes here. Is it going to matter after the next 10 minutes, 10 months, or 10 years? So those are the time frames you can ask yourself to think about. That email that you're going to respond to, is that email going to matter in 10 minutes? Is it going to matter in 10 months? Is it going to matter in 10 years? So the fact that your flight got delayed to LA, does that matter in 10 months from now? Probably not. Does it matter that your flight got delayed in 10 years from now? Certainly not. In 10 minutes, sure, yeah, it still might matter because you're still not in LA where you're supposed to be. But that can help you understand your process as to where you're going. When you think about it like long-term with investments and where you're spending your time learning or things you're interested in, are you going to get value back from, if you're doing something, if you're eating junk food or junk food of the mind or watching too much Netflix, a little bit's good. Is that going to help you in 10 minutes? Sure, because you're going to be entertained. Is it going to help you in 10 months from now? Probably not. And it's most certainly not going to help you in 10 years unless, your job becomes a editor writing about those things. So some other good questions to think about. Next up, this one is from Visa. Says, what if I'm the new guy who just inherited a mess and I can do anything I want with it? So he says that this helps to shake out sunk cost patterns. That's a great one. If you're coming in new, especially when you don't have perspective on how everything works or why things work a certain way, I think when you get into a new situation, you think, why do we do things this way? Or I'm going to change the process to be like this. I think it's better if we do this first. And then all of a sudden you either figure out one of two things. One, people are just doing things a certain way, which the classic story that I've heard is, a lady gets a pan out and she cuts off half of a roast and she puts it in the pan and cooks it. The husband sees her do that and goes, why do you do that? And she says, I don't know, my grandma used to cut off half of the roast. And then the grandma comes over for dinner and they say, Grandma, why did you cut off half of the roast? And she says, because we didn't have a pan that fit it. So, it's just a behavior that had been passed down. No one knew why they did. They cut off half the roast. This lady had a plenty big pan to put the roast in, but she was just cutting off and throwing away half of the roast. So challenging those patterns, challenging what people are doing. It's tricky when you're new and you come into something because people have their established way of doing it. They maybe don't want to do it a new way. They're used to doing it a certain way. But if you can find ways that can make it more efficient, similar to that second question we talked about with how important is this really? If you have a new set of eyeballs coming in, you can ask, how important really is this task? What does it get done? What does it accomplish? And how can you sort out some of the messiness that's maybe accumulated over a couple of years? It's a little bit like if your room is messy, you notice it over the course of a month get messy. Like every day it only gets a little bit messier. But if someone new comes into your house, they're like, whoa, your room is really messy. You're like, it's not that, yeah, it's pretty bad. Like if you come home from vacation and look at your own room, it's probably pretty messy versus just living in it. The old boil the frog slowly. So taking a step back and looking at that, especially when you're new, so you don't just keep those systems and traditions going. You have to respect them. You have to figure out why things are a certain way. But for the most part, challenge those things. Somebody else says that's ZeroBased Design, and you can kind of drop all assumptions and see what matters. Steve on Speed says, does this truly matter to my life? More often than not, the answer is no, he says. So, it really goes back to a lot of those like little small decisions, triggering emotions, small factors, things that really just don't matter in a year from now. Just asking yourself kind of in that moment so you don't get caught up, you don't get frustrated, that you can avoid a lot of that angst that you feel, having to interact, having to prove you're right, having to care what other people think, like just not caring at all. Another great one from Leo Polovets is, what part of this situation is under my control? That's a huge one for me within the last year. Just like, what do you control in this scenario? I'm not going to say I'm a control freak, or at least I never thought I was. I don't know the true answer to that question, but the more you realize you have less control. You can't control the traffic. If you're late to the airport and there's traffic, see, this is where I go back and forth on this. So this is a question for the comments. Like, if you're going to the airport and there's traffic, in my opinion, like, that's on you. It's not on the traffic. Because you could have left earlier, you could have taken a different route, you could have checked the maps before. Look, I'm not saying you got to sleep over at the airport to make sure you're there the next morning, because, like, that's not a good way. That's how I can take my stuff too far, like, because then it really is in your control because you're sleeping at the airport, but then you're insane. But for example, like, you're not in control of the traffic, so it's a similar situation. Like, if you need to do something at 10 o'clock and it relies on internet, should you have backup internet at all times? Should you be at your computer instead of on your phone? The reason to go deep down into my psychology of why I feel that way about this whole sleeping over at the airport thing is, like, I just grew up and it's like, if you mess something up, it's your fault. That's just the way it was. If you fell off the monkey bars and broke your arm, like, you shouldn't have been climbing on the monkey bars. Now, I don't think that's true so much anymore. The older I get, I'm like, that's kind of, can't blame anybody for everything. There are random things that happen that are not your fault. People get sick and you're like, that person didn't get sick. Whereas the old models, like, this person got sick, oh, they were a smoker, they made that happen. Like, that's just kind of the model of people ultimately, like, get what they deserve. No one deserves to get sick, but things seem to happen for a reason. But there are just things that are completely out of your control. You see it all the time on the news, and that's what's so scary. That's what's so terrifying about everything. You as a human want to think there's a reason that things happen. I think that gives you comfort when you realize that you don't have control of everything. It probably is very, very scary. So maybe that's, like, the mechanism as to why that works. I went deep there. Might have not made a ton of sense. Be more than happy to clarify, but that was just some in-the-moment thinking. But in regards to what part of the situation is under your control, it's kind of like just vigilance against anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So one thing I enjoy is, like, keeping my laundry done, keeping my video game, like, patches up to date in case I want to play the game. I might not have played a game in 6 months, but I want to keep it up to date so that when I do log in and want to play, it's up to date. It's probably a huge waste of time, but I don't want to be somewhere, decide I want to play, and then have to download a huge thing, because it would have been under my control to do that previously. So I get it. Not everything's under your control. It's tricky. It's really hard. If you get to the airport and there's a long line at security, we were supposed to go back 6 months in time and get TSA pre-check? That's what I would have said earlier. I'm trying to get over that. But it's a really good question to ask yourself, like, what can you control? Especially because so many things are not under your control, and that's okay. And you can learn to accept that, but then you also got to realize there may be some things you can do, learning situations of, like, well, what could we have done better there? How could we make sure that when we used to stream, we used to do This Week in Madden, like, we would record a backup of the stream. That's under your control. Like, if your computer hard drive dies, that happens. But you know that happens, so you should have a backup of the hard drive. I think the thing to resist here is, if you say, what part of the situation is under my control? Well, my computer hard drive died. It's out of my control. It is out of your control, but what was under your control was other things you could have done. I'm taking this question as, like, don't stress out about things you can't control. I think that's a positive thing to do, and I'm just putting it on. And then I'm saying there's also a lot of things you can't control. I'm a little bit of an over-controller like that. However, maybe there's a fine line in the middle where, like, you're not sleeping over at the airport, you're not backing up your files every 10 seconds, and it's okay if you lose a couple files because your hard drive broke. I don't know. There's got to be a happy medium. If you get too in the control game, it drives you nuts. But if you also just, like, well, I guess there's nothing we could have done there. It's like we could have done a ton of things. We could have tested this. We could have practiced that. We could have, done all kinds of things to control the situation. That's why I like sports. It's like you prepare for everything in sports. That's what that is like, and it's a low risk thing. Like if the Chiefs in the Super Bowl were prepared for a flea flicker because they saw them run it, and then the Niners didn't run it, it's like, hey, well, at least we prepared for that. Whereas if a team runs the flea flicker, it's like, how could we have known they were going to run a flea flicker? It's like they ran a flea flicker in week 3. You can't. Come on. I don't know. I went deep. That might have made no sense. Hopefully it did. I had a friend who said, why am I talking? That is a great question. Talk less. Weird advice for a guy giving a podcast. I would say, like, in a lot of meetings I go to, I don't like to talk. Sometimes I will speak up, like, you know what, I should say something here, and I'll say something, and then, like, 10 minutes after the meeting, I'm like, why did I talk? Why would I say that? That was so stupid. That made no sense. Every now and then you got to speak up, and you got to say what's on your mind, but for the most part, the less talking you do, the more listening you do, the better off you're going to be, and I can tell you 100 times I've spoken up and regretted it. So why am I talking? That's a good one. What are you afraid of? So what are you afraid of is a good question. That's a fear-setting exercise where you could say, like, what am I ultimately afraid of? And then how likely is that to happen? And if that was to happen, what would I do? So, I'm afraid of missing my flight. So, well, what can I do? And it really, if you miss your flight, okay, you're going to get to the destination within 4 hours later. So if you spend all night, you don't sleep, you panic, you leave early, you sleep over at the airport, over the fear that you're going to have to take a 2-hour later flight. Maybe you'll look into those flights later so you know what would happen if you did miss it. That way you get rid of the fear because you're like, well, the worst that could happen is this. And once you know what you're actually afraid of, what you're really stressing over, you'll be good to go. Will this matter a year from now? We covered that one. Another good one is, what would it look like if this were easy? Tremendous question. I talk about it. This podcast is what it would look like if it was easy. If it was good, it would look completely different. But since it's easy, like I said, this is the first alone moment I've had to record this in about 3 weeks. So it's easy. That's what it is. It's a microphone and a camera. If it was special, there'd be an effect, there'd be a graphic, there'd be more cutting, there'd be a background with little helmets and all kinds of stuff. But to record this, to do what I got to do, this is what it would look like if it was easy. And good is the enemy of great, or great is the enemy of good. One of those. How can you just get it done? How can you get consistent? How can you get quick, get faster, get more feedback, and keep competing? Am I being present? That's a great question. I think the hard part about that is noticing that you're not present. So if you're supposed to be relaxing or hanging out, or your intention is to be out on a walk, but you're thinking about that email or what that guy said or that flight you missed, and you're just going over and over and over again, it's like, what is the trigger that will make you recognize that you're thinking about that loop, and then how can you stop thinking about it? Because to stop thinking about it, you got to think about it. So then you'll know that you're not being present in the moment, especially if you want to be present. People sometimes don't want to be present. They would rather be on their phones, and that's cool too. But if you decide, hey, I'd like to soak this moment in, I'm at a park or a game, like, I'm not going to go to a sports game and then look down on my phone for the entire game. I want to be present at the game and enjoy it. But you got to catch yourself. I catch myself less like looking down on my phone when I'm at stuff, but more just thinking about whatever my troubles are that day. Just thinking about, I bet this person's going to say, I'm going to say this. And then it's like you're walking around. I'm walking around a lake. It's nice water. The sun's out. The trees are great. And I'm just thinking about something totally different. It's like you're not even walking around a lake. Like you'll look up and you'll be like, whoa, there's a lake right there. Are you being present? It's a great question. Great one here from Joshua. If I'm saying yes to this, what am I saying no to? Time is a finite resource. Zero sum, can't get more. If you say yes to something, you're not actively saying no to something, which is what his question is but you are technically saying no to something because you're prioritizing the thing you're saying yes to over something else. So Talked about those 5 pillars in the first episode or the second episode about, what I'm thinking about, what I'm focused on. If you say yes to buying this video game, that's 20 hours you're going to put into it, potentially, that has to come from the family time bucket, the fitness bucket, the food bucket, whatever the other buckets I had were. It's going to cause you to say no to those things. The big struggle, and why this is a great question, is you don't even notice that you're saying no to those other things unless you're paying a lot of attention, so you got to consider that. Okay, couple more questions here, and then I'll kind of give you some of those questions. Obviously, I do think about a lot of these questions, and in some of my answers, you can think about what I've been trending towards the most, but a good one from Miguel is, what's the smallest step I can do now to improve my process? So, similar to Tim, what is my 80-20 in this situation? So that's the Pareto principle, 80% of your value comes from 20% of your time. What is the cost benefit of this? The 80-20 of this podcast is the doing it. The 20% is going to be the bells and whistles. Those editing it, cutting it down, adding graphics. Though it takes 30 minutes to record it, and it takes 2.5 hours to put it together. So I'm getting and just posting it, you're going to get 80% of the value. Yeah, you're not going to. Some people are not going to watch it. They're not going to think it's good quality, all that. But that's not what it's really there for. What are you really mad at? I think that's similar to the first question, but I think the first question may be phrased better. Is this something future me would feel happy, proud about? Does this align with my mission? If you write that out, that's similar to the will this matter in 10 years a little bit, because ultimately you should have an overarching goal, and you should ask, is this going towards what I want to be doing? What are you constantly avoiding? It's a good one about procrastination. What if I just say no? Great question. Say no more. What problem am I trying to solve? Am I taking from or giving to my future self? That's good. Opportunity cost. If I do this, what won't I be able to do? That's similar to the question we just talked about, which was, if you say yes to this, what are you saying no to? What would have to change my mind? That's a good one when you're thinking about, if you're having a conversation with somebody and you're set and you're not going to change your mind, what's the point in having that conversation if you're not open to it, if you're not going to change your mind in any way? Or if, you're negotiating with somebody and they're giving you a no, it's like, well, what would you need to, it's a question salespeople ask all the time, like, what would you need to feel better about this, or to go home with this today, or do that, or whatever, because those convinced against their will are of the same opinion still. Right. Do I really need to say something that's similar to why am I talking, which is hilarious? Why am I so lucky? That's a good question to trigger the gratitude, to think about all the great things that you do have, like that hot water in the shower. Is it going to matter in 10 years? And that is pretty much it. They're all kind of similar to those. And I think, obviously, those questions impart overarching principles. They're the first principles of a lot of thought experiments, things that you're thinking about, questions you can ask yourself. All those questions basically pull you, hopefully, out of the moment of emotion. Like, they pull you out of negative emotion. Emotion can be positive. It can be inspiring. It can cause you to take action, but it can also be negative because you can just be locked in, focused, not thinking about perspective. Is this going to matter in 10 years? So those thoughts are contradictive a little bit, where if you're emotional and upset, they cause you to hopefully pull back your scale and look at things on a wider horizon to say, is this going to matter in 10 months? Or they cause you to focus in on the moment. Like, you're here. Are you present? Are you paying attention? Are you thinking about things? And then a lot of them are obviously about optimization and not getting stressed out with things you can't control. So those were the 3 areas. Like I said, the 3 most important questions to me. Number 1 is, what can I control? What can I not control? What's the right level of being proactive versus being a control freak or just over the top ridiculous sleeping at the airport. That's one. Second one, what would this look like if it were easy, which is a lesson it took me a long time to learn. And the third, I would give a nod to will this matter in 10 years over what am I afraid of, just because I think that fear setting can be a good example. So that's a great thread. Head on over, check that out. Like I said, if you haven't checked out that book already, it was in our list. It's called Atomic Habits, James Clear. It's one I listened to end of last year, or end of 2018. But it's a book I want to go back in and just listen to frequently because I think it's so important, and I think it's like almost just a rhythm you want in your head. It's something you always want to be considering with your habits and all that. But that's a great topic, great questions, awesome people in that thread to click on and follow too. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Stay Hungry podcast. I know it's been a moment, but we're going to try and get to that 10 as we promised, and we got to get our S. Gibbs episode in. This is number 6. If you have questions, topics, things you want to hear about, things you want to talk about, let me know in the comments. Until next time, this is Farls. Stay hungry and lock up.